Hello and welcome back to Jess Checks Out Books, and we are going to be talking about the best of 2025 today. Now, this is one of two parts. Why? Because I read 75 fantasy books last year and I decided not to make this list all fantasy. So there is a list of the best for that coming, and then this is the best of the rest. I also read a lot of YA, middle grade, young readers and stuff, and I'm going to have that come out in February. Some of these actually even came off my shelf. Yay, go me. I'm terrible about reading books that are on my shelf. Physical, some are digital, but they are what they are, and I've had some of them for a while. I also got a lot of these from the library and Kindle Unlimited, as well as I think maybe Audible too. Let's start with book one, which is Mad Women's Ball. This one was a very hard read for me, but I very much enjoyed it. It was about 1800s Paris and the women's asylum, how women were treated, what was happening. I believe it's translated. I could go get off my shelf, but I'm kind of lazy. I found it to be a fascinating look at how women were viewed. And if you've read anything like Regency romance from, British historical romance, you can recognize some of these signs. And I say that because there are quite a few historical romance writers who do a lot of research. People like Sarah MacLean, Tessa Dare, when she was still alive, Jo Beverly. Like, there was a ton of ongoing research and stuff like that. So I understood some of this, but it was very interesting just to see how bleak it was. And I didn't expect to like it so much. I bought it on a whim a couple years ago, and it became one of my best favorite books of last year. Then I decided to read The Lies I Tell. And this was a thriller that I actually liked. I have issues with thrillers. I don't always like them. I think they are too ... And I have a whole video coming out about Freida McFadden. I've read 4 of her books. We'll get into that. But for now, I want to talk about The Lies I Tell. There was convergent storylines and how they came together and flew apart and came together and flew apart. I found that to be utterly fascinating. I also really appreciated the fact that the stories were individual but connected in a way that was, you wanted to see what was going on. You were empathetic to both of the women. You saw how things had changed, and so you really wanted to follow along. I found it to be a really good thriller, and like I said, I have kind of given up on the genre for the most part, but I really enjoyed this one, and it was one of the few. Then I read Credenza by Wendy. And now, I've known Wendy for a while. I have to admit this. I've known her since she was writing romances. And I liked her romances, but I think that being in her horror genre is much better. She's in pink horror, which is feminist horror. And this one had very interesting vibes from the feelings of the 80s and 90s and even some late 70s horror films. It had that feeling of you were watching it through a non 4K world, and I liked that. I felt it was a really fun example, and like I said, I don't read a lot of horror. I have a few that I really love, and this one is going in that list because the characters and the beat of it, and it felt so nostalgic in the best way. And it's about what happens if your family is cursed. I don't want to give too much away because I think that as an indie, it's really a disservice to kind of go through that way because of the way indie authors have to make their money nowadays. So I want to recommend it because I read a lot of indies now, and this is definitely one of them that I was happy with. Then I read The Knight and the Butcherbird by Alex E. Harrow. Now, if you know me, you know I love Alex E. Harrow. Harrow actually had a couple of books that I read last year. I'm still waiting on The Everlasting and The Six Deaths of the Saint. I thought it was phenomenal. And it's kind of like the beginning kernel of Everlasting, and that's why I'm not talking about it, because I haven't read Everlasting yet. I'm waiting to find Everlasting at a more reasonable price for me to afford because my library doesn't have it and Kindle Unlimited obviously doesn't have it. So The Knight and the Butcherbird is this great sci-fi fantasy type world, and it's post-apocalyptic, but it's set in the Smoky Mountains area. There's a lot of interesting religious dynamics and interesting ways of seeing it, and I don't bunch of different kind of things, right? And so I think that's very important to note because there's a lot of really cool information to be found. And some parts really stood out to me. And I love the fact that Butcherbird, which is a Wren, I think, was so well written, and the character was so developed, but you could see more and more and more. And it was just walking through this really interesting world that I wanted to see more of. And then you have Atmosphere by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I know this made a lot of people's list, and I'm one of them. Now, I love Taylor, I don't love Taylor kind of person, right? I haven't liked all of her previous work. I found Malibu Rising to be my end game there because I felt it was too much, but I really liked this one. Imagine the 1980s and going up into space and being able to like have women in space and have, men and women fighting together and training together. And what happens if you're not straight? What happens when you're in charge of relationships and responsibilities that you didn't know you wanted or needed, and now you're kind of in flux because of your career? How do you survive that in 1980s homophobic, anti-alternative, you can't see it, but I'm air quoting here, life? And I say that because that's kind of the moral majority and all that kind of feelings back then. So there's this really soft weaving of the stories together and what happens. There's like the sci-fi element, there's the historical fiction side of it, and together I think it really works. I listened to the audiobook, and the audiobook was fantastic, for the record. And then, okay, so To Iceland with Love is one I found purely by accident, because I'm going to do a video on this too, but the 52 book club for 2025 bingo board had a reading challenge board, had, a place with an active volcano. Okay, so I was looking at it and I found, Iceland has one. Well, this is not set in Iceland, it's set in America, but Iceland has got its play part in there. Now, what's interesting is this reminds me a lot of feeling of Romancing the Stone meets, like, I guess, Mr. and Mrs. Smith meets True Lies meets, Undercover Blues from the 80s and 90s. Like, it's got that very, like, feeling of happiness that I get from those particular kind of movies. And I just found it to be hilarious. It was funny, and they go to different places. They're in, like, I think Cuba, and sometimes they're in America, they're in a couple of other countries, and they're bouncing around, and it was a fun read, and I'd never heard of it. I found it on Kindle Unlimited, and I highly recommend you read it, honestly, truly. Next we have Cronus, and I love this book. I love the author. I loved Ring Shout. But what I liked about this one was it was an interesting sci-fi look. It's one of those short Amazon stories, because I like to read a variety of styles. I don't just like to read long books, short books, audiobooks. I vary up what I read all the time. And so in this one, you have what happens when you can mess with the state of things, right? I think it's the butterfly effect, or to me, it reminds me of the thing that the Ninth Doctor said about you can't go back in time and fix your timeline when, he was talking to Rose. So it's got that same feeling of what can you change and what is different when you see what's going on. It was just really fascinating look into racism. They've got things almost like there are parts where you've got speakeasy libraries, basically. So it's this really interesting look at what's going on. After that, I have to recommend The Restoration Garden, which is a 1940 setting. It's in England. What happens when who you are is not enough, and when people that you love reject? And it's about restoring this garden that has not been touched in 70 years or something like that at this time, 80 years, because it's post-war. You kind of like weave in and out of the past and the present, and there's just something very relaxing and comfortable and heartbreaking, and you just feel so bad for these characters because you can see what's going on. They can't, and you just want to protect them, right? So again, I found this because it hit like the 1940s thing on my 52 book club board, and I was impressed. I did not expect that, but I was like, oh, okay, I like it. Then you have A Summer of Static, and this one, if you're going to read any of them off this list, this is the one to read. It is about a robot who is brought back from an AI universe. The robot has sentience, it has thoughts, it has feelings. It's it's trying to get comfortable with itself. It was brought back without its decision. It was all these things, and it's a very clear, trans overlay to it, but there's just so much beautiful writing and beautiful world setting. The characters are all someone that you want their success. I had never heard of this book. I don't know if anyone else has. I don't know how popular it is because I found it on Kindle Unlimited. But this book blew my mind. I couldn't not love this book. I found it to be so delicately written, but written in a way that wove all the delicate strands to make a strong story. And I cannot talk about this book enough. I may actually do a video on it at some point, but this book was beautiful, and this book had my heart. Then I read North of the Sunlit River is about Alaska and migrating there. And I say migrating because there's a lot of discussion about the ecology and, the actions of humans and man and stuff like that. And the most beautiful thing I found in this one was how devastating it was. And that sounds silly, but the emotional weight, and there's a little bit of, a magical realism at some point. But there's this beautiful feeling of connection and wanting to be and how to survive and how to move on and what do you do, and just wonderfully lovely story. And there are so many devastating elements that are uplifted by the connection of the characters. And I love that about it. This was for the 52 Book Club about a direction on the cover. And so I just happened to find this because I was on Kindle Unlimited. I think this is a book that you need to read, honestly. I think that it's a book, if you like fiction that is contemporary, but not like overly verbose, overly clever, but has that deep connection, I highly recommend this one. And finally, we have Countess. Now, I have never read The Count of Monte Cristo, because I do not have 1,000 hours to read it. That thing is like 1,000 pages. No, thank you. Look, I know my limits. Anne Rice was enough for me as a child. I read The Witching Hour, and that thing was like what? But Countess is a retelling of The Count of Monte Cristo set in space. And I like that kind of reimagining, and she is the one in charge. Like, it's her getting back out of something that she was not necessarily put in for the right reasons, and how to be intelligent and bright and move around and survive this new reality of afterward. It's also very, in my opinion, it's also very black-coded. And so it's got that feeling of not fitting in even in space, and the classic sci-fi thing of always ongoing battle. And so I just found this to be absolutely amazing. I bought it years ago. I had it on Audible. I bought it for credit, I don't know, like 2 or 3 years ago. I think it was like 2024. Because I was really curious about it, and I kept looking for it, but it was very expensive. And my Audible credit I already had because I had to use them up. And so I'm so glad I picked this book. A strong female character who is not necessarily unlikable, but not likable. The character shifts between the two, right? And so you really see code switching, I guess is what I would call it. Like, she code switches a lot. And her relationships are very transactional to some elements and not. I really liked the fact that you had this strong narrative in a very short book, because the audiobook was only less than 5 hours. So you had to pull a lot in there to make this work. And there was a lot of really good elements. I loved all of these books. I moved a few of them around. I felt like the ones I had on the list didn't really fit, so I moved them back and forth and added a few. Like, I added Countess, and I had to actually add Countess at the end because I was impressed with the storytelling there. Sometimes my best books are not always the 5-star reads, right? Like, I love my 5-star reads, don't get me wrong, but I had like 30 of them or something last year. These are ones that make their mark on me, the ones that really stood out and who had something different to tell. And every single one of these books has got a different narrative and a different choice and a different way of being. And I love that. And I hope you guys read these. Again, a lot of these are books I haven't seen people talk about. And I think that, and part of that, some of them are old, but also I think that, my reading varies so much that I don't often see them on BookTube. So I want to put some of these out, the ones that people don't know or the ones they don't see a lot of. Can you tell me what some of your best books of 2025 were? Like I said, the fantasy one is coming up soon. There's a lot. There's more than this. But I wanted you guys to kind of see how I read. And I will talk to you guys soon. Bye.